Police found little girl at the bakery. Dad would give me candy if I let him pour it in. Officer cry. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning rain fell soft against the windows of Maple's Bakery, creating a rhythm that usually brought comfort to the small town of Millbrook, Maine. Inside, the smell of fresh bread wrapped around the customers like a warm blanket, mingling with the sweet scent of cinnamon rolls just pulled from the oven. Margaret Walsh wiped down the counter with practiced movements, her eyes occasionally drifting to the clock on the wall. It was just past 8 in the morning, and the usual crowd of early risers had already come and gone, leaving behind empty coffee cups and the lingering warmth of morning conversation. But there was something different today, something that made Margaret's hands slow as she folded the dishcloth. Near the display case filled with golden pastries and chocolate croissants stood a little girl, no more than 7 years old, with tangled brown hair that fell past her shoulders. Her dress, once probably a cheerful blue, hung loose on her thin frame, wrinkled as if she had slept in it for days. Margaret had noticed her about 40 minutes ago when she first walked in, small hands pressed against her stomach, eyes wide and searching. The child hadn't moved since then, hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even blinked much. She just stood there, still as a photograph, watching the door as if waiting for someone who never came. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. The girl's eyes were dark and hollow, like she carried secrets too heavy for such a young soul. When Margaret got close enough, she could see the child was trembling slightly. Whether from cold or fear or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. The girl's lips were pale, and there was a strange puffiness to her small belly that didn't match her thin arms and legs. Something was very wrong here, and Margaret felt it deep in her bones. She knelt down to the child's level, her knees protesting with age. The girl finally looked at her, and in those eyes, Margaret saw something that broke her heart into 1,000 pieces. Not defiance, not anger, just quiet acceptance of whatever the world decided to do to her next. Before Margaret could speak, the bell above the door chimed, and Officer Carter Hale walked in, bringing with him a gust of cold October air. Carter was a fixture in Millbrook, known for his morning coffee ritual and his genuine care for the community. He was in his mid-30s, tall, with kind eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes landed immediately on the little girl, and his expression changed from casual greeting to sharp concern in an instant. He moved toward them with purpose, his hand instinctively touching the radio on his shoulder. Margaret stood up, her face showing the same worry Carter felt blooming in his chest. The girl watched him approach, and for a moment something like hope flickered across her features before fading back into that terrible stillness. Carter crouched down, making himself smaller, less intimidating. His voice when he spoke was gentle, the kind of gentle that came from real understanding of fear. The girl's lips moved, forming words so soft they were almost lost in the quiet hum of the bakery's overhead lights. But Carter heard them, and they hit him like a physical blow. She said her daddy told her to wait here, that he would come back soon, that everything would be okay if she just stayed quiet and didn't cause trouble. The words were simple, innocent, the kind any child might say. But the way she said them, with that resigned acceptance, told Carter this was a pattern, not an isolated incident. He looked up at Margaret, and without words, they both understood. This child had been waiting too long, in more ways than one. Carter pulled out his phone, his movement slow and deliberate, not wanting to scare her. He asked the girl her name, and after a long pause, she whispered it so quietly he had to lean in to hear. Ellie. Her name was Ellie Brennan, and no, she didn't know exactly where she lived, just that it was far and they didn't go to town much. Her daddy worked a lot, she explained, her small fingers twisting the hem of her dirty dress. He worked so much that sometimes she forgot what he looked like when he smiled. Margaret brought over a glass of warm milk, and Ellie's eyes fixed on it with an intensity that spoke of real hunger. But she didn't reach for it, didn't move until Carter gently pushed it toward her and told her it was okay, that she could drink it. Her hands shook as she lifted the glass, and she drank in small, careful sips, as if afraid someone might take it away. Carter watched her, his jaw tight, his mind already running through protocols and procedures. But more than that, he was seeing a child who had learned not to ask for help, not to expect kindness, not to hope for more than whatever scraps the world decided to throw her way. He thought of his own childhood, of his mother working 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, of the nights he went to bed with his stomach growling. But even then, he had never looked like this. Even then, someone had always been there. Ellie finished the milk and set the glass down with trembling hands, and when she looked up at Carter, she asked in a voice barely above a whisper if she had done something wrong, if her daddy would be mad. The question gutted him. He told her no, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that he just wanted to help. But even as he said it, he wondered if she believed him, or if she had stopped believing in help a long time ago. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency, as if the sky itself knew something terrible was unfolding. Carter called for an ambulance, his voice low but firm, explaining to dispatch that he had a child in possible distress, that he needed medical assistance immediately. Ellie's eyes widened at the word ambulance, and she shrank back slightly, her small body tensing like she might run. Carter quickly reassured her, telling her that the doctors just wanted to make sure she was feeling okay, that they were nice people who helped children feel better. But Ellie shook her head slowly, her voice barely audible as she said she wasn't allowed to go to doctors, that her daddy said they cost too much money, that they would be fine without them. The words painted a picture Carter didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. Margaret stood nearby, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears threatening to spill down her weathered cheeks. She had raised 4 children of her own, had seen them through scraped knees and broken hearts, and she knew in her soul that this child needed more than a warm glass of milk. The minutes stretched long and heavy, until finally, the ambulance arrived, its lights flashing red and blue through the rain-soaked windows. The paramedics entered with their equipment and their calm efficiency, but even they paused when they saw Ellie, their professional masks slipping for just a moment to reveal shock and sadness. One of them, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and gentle hands, knelt beside Ellie and began asking questions in a soft voice. Ellie answered in fragments, pieces of a story that didn't quite fit together, about her daddy and the white powder he put in her drinks, about how it was supposed to make her not hungry anymore, about how he said it was expensive and special, and that she should be grateful. Sarah's eyes met Carter's over Ellie's head, and the look they exchanged said everything. This wasn't malicious intent. This was desperation taken too far, ignorance mixed with poverty creating a dangerous cocktail that a child was paying the price for. They needed to get Ellie to the hospital, needed to run tests, needed to understand exactly what that powder was and what it had done to her small body. Carter rode with them in the ambulance, his presence seeming to calm Ellie slightly, though she still gripped the edge of the stretcher with white-knuckled fingers. As they pulled away from the bakery, Carter looked back through the rain-streaked windows and saw Margaret standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the shop, and he wondered how many other children were out there, standing silent and still, waiting for someone to notice them before it was too late. At Millbrook General Hospital, the emergency room buzzed with controlled urgency as Ellie was brought in on the stretcher, her small form almost lost beneath the white sheets. Nurses moved quickly but carefully, their faces professional masks hiding the concern Carter could see flickering in their eyes. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the pediatrician on duty, appeared within minutes, her dark eyes sharp, as she assessed Ellie with a practiced gaze that missed nothing. She spoke to Ellie in a calm, measured voice, asking questions about how she felt, where it hurt, when she last ate a real meal. Ellie's answers came slowly, hesitantly, as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing and getting someone in trouble. She mentioned stomach aches that came and went, feeling tired all the time, and nights when she couldn't sleep because her belly hurt too much. Doctor? Chen's expression remained neutral, but Carter noticed the slight tightening around her mouth, the way her jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. She ordered a full panel of tests, blood work, imaging, a complete physical examination. As they wheeled Ellie away to begin the tests, she reached out suddenly, her small hand grasping Carter's sleeve with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide and frightened, and she asked in a voice that cracked with emotion if her daddy would know where to find her, if he would be worried when he came back to the bakery and she wasn't there. Carter felt something break inside his chest, a fissure opening up between the officer he was trained to be and the human being he couldn't help being. He promised her that he would make sure her father knew where she was, that everything would be okay. But even as he said the words, he wondered if they were true, if anything about this situation could ever really be okay again. He watched her disappear down the hallway, her small face turning back to look at him one last time before the doors swung closed. Carter stood in the waiting area, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, his badge too heavy. He pulled out his notebook and began writing down everything he had observed, every word Ellie had said, every detail that might be important later. But his mind kept drifting back to that image of her standing in the bakery, so still and so small, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was all she could do. Dr. Chen emerged an hour later, her face grave as she gestured for Carter to follow her to a private consultation room. The space was small and sterile, with motivational posters on the walls that seemed cruelly ironic given the conversation they were about to have. She closed the door and took a deep breath before speaking, and Carter braced himself for what he already suspected but didn't want to hear. The tests revealed moderate malnutrition, she explained, her voice clinical, but unable to completely hide her anger. Ellie's body was showing signs of prolonged inadequate nutrition, her growth potentially stunted, her development delayed. The swelling in her abdomen was likely due to a combination of factors related to poor diet and whatever supplement her father had been giving her. Dr. Chen pulled up images on her tablet, showing Carter the results in stark black and white. There were also signs of general neglect, she continued, her eyes hard. Ellie's teeth showed evidence of poor dental hygiene. Her skin had multiple minor infections that had gone untreated, and her overall physical condition suggested a child who had been without proper care for an extended period. But what concerned Dr. Chen most was the psychological state. Ellie showed signs of learned helplessness, a passivity that wasn't normal for a child her age. She didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't ask for things children should ask for. She had learned that her needs didn't matter, that speaking up brought nothing but disappointment, so she had stopped trying. Carter listened to all of this with growing horror, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He asked about the powder, about what the father had been giving her. Dr. Chen shook her head. Based on Ellie's description and the symptoms, it was likely some kind of protein supplement or meal replacement shake, probably purchased cheaply online or at a discount store. Not inherently dangerous in moderation for adults, but completely inappropriate as a primary nutrition source for a growing child. The father likely thought he was helping, thought he was providing something better than nothing, not understanding that a child's body needed proper meals, vitamins, nutrients that couldn't come from a powder mixed with water. It was a tragedy born of ignorance and desperation, but the result was the same. A child had suffered. Carter asked what happened next, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly, sympathy mixing with her professional resolve. They had to report this to Child Protective Services, she said. There was no choice. Ellie couldn't go back to an environment where she wasn't being properly cared for, where her basic needs weren't being met. The system would have to get involved, assessments would be made, decisions would be reached. But for now, Ellie would stay in the hospital until they were sure she was stable, and until CPS could arrange appropriate placement. The words hung in the air like a sentence being passed. Carter knew it was the right thing to do, knew it was necessary, but he also knew that for Ellie this would feel like another betrayal, another proof that hoping for better only led to more pain. He thanked Dr. Chen and left the consultation room, his mind already moving to the next step. He needed to find Jameson Brennan, needed to understand how a father could let things get this bad, needed to see if there was any explanation that could make sense of what he had witnessed. He returned to the station and ran Ellie's name through the system, pulling up records that painted a troubling picture. The Brennan family lived at an address on the outskirts of town, a mobile home park that had seen better days decades ago. There were no previous reports of neglect or abuse, no red flags in the system, which meant this had been happening quietly, invisibly, a slow deterioration that no one had noticed until it reached a crisis point. Carter gathered the information he needed and headed out to his patrol car, the rain still falling in sheets that turned the world gray and blurred. As he drove toward the mobile home park, he thought about all the invisible children out there, the ones suffering behind closed doors, the ones who had learned that silence was safer than speaking up. He thought about Ellie standing in that bakery, waiting with heartbreaking patience for a father who might never come, and he felt a determination settle in his bones. He would find Jamison Brennan. He would get answers. And somehow, he would make sure that Ellie never had to stand alone and silent again, waiting for help that should have come a long time ago. The mobile home park sat at the edge of Millbrook like a forgotten afterthought, its entrance marked by a faded sign that had once promised affordable living and community. Now it just looked tired. Rows of weathered trailers with sagging steps and patched roofs, yards where children's toys lay abandoned in the mud next to rusting cars that might never run again. Carter pulled his patrol car slowly down the narrow main road, checking addresses against the information he had pulled from the system. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the sky remained heavy and gray, casting everything in a dim light that made the whole place look like a photograph from another era. He found the Brennan residence at the end of a cul-de-sac, a single-wide trailer that had probably been white once but was now a dingy gray-beige, streaked with rust stains running down from the metal roof. The small yard was mostly dirt and weeds, with a few scattered attempts at flowers that had long since died. A broken plastic chair sat on the narrow porch, and the windows were covered with faded curtains that didn't quite close all the way. Carter sat in his car for a moment, studying the place, trying to understand the life that happened behind those walls. It didn't look like a place where intentional cruelty lived. It looked like a place where people were barely hanging on, where every day was a struggle just to keep the lights on and the rain out. He got out and approached the trailer, his boots squelching in the muddy ground. He knocked on the door, the sound hollow and tinny against the thin metal. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out that he was with the Millbrook Police Department, that he needed to speak with Jamison Brennan. Still nothing. Carter tried the handle and found it locked. He stepped back and looked around the property, noting the lack of any vehicle, the general stillness that suggested no one had been home for a while. He was about to return to his car when a voice called out from the neighboring trailer. An elderly woman stood on her porch, wrapped in a faded bathrobe despite the afternoon hour, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She peered at Carter with eyes that had seen too much and judged too little. He walked over to her, introducing himself and explaining that he was looking for Jamison Brennan, that it was important he speak with him. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Callahan, nodded slowly and gestured for him to come closer. She had a weathered face that spoke of hard years and harder choices, but her eyes were kind. She told Carter that Jamison worked at the packaging plant over in Riverside, about 20 miles away, and that he was rarely home. He worked double shifts most days, she said, sometimes leaving before dawn and not coming back until after dark. And the little girl, Ellie, she was often alone, though Mrs. Callahan had seen her around less and less lately. Carter felt his stomach tighten. He asked if Mrs. Callahan had ever been concerned, ever thought to call anyone. She looked away, shame coloring her wrinkled cheeks. She admitted she had thought about it, but she also knew Jamison was trying his best after his wife left. She had seen him crying on his porch late at night, had watched him lose weight and age years and months. She thought he just needed time to figure things out, that interfering might make things worse. Besides, she said quietly, people around here didn't trust authorities much. Too many times help had come in the form of taking children away, tearing families apart rather than giving them what they needed to stay together. Carter understood the sentiment, even as it frustrated him. He thanked Mrs. Callahan for the information and got the name and address of the packaging plant. As he turned to leave, she called after him, her voice trembling slightly. She asked if Ellie was okay, if she was safe. Carter paused, choosing his words carefully. He told her that Ellie was getting medical care, that she would be safe now. Mrs. Callahan nodded, tears welling in her eyes, and whispered that she should have done something sooner, that she would carry that regret for the rest of her days. Carter drove to Riverside, the route taking him through rural Maine countryside that would have been beautiful in better weather and better circumstances. Instead, it just felt isolating, mile after mile of gray sky and bare trees, small towns that looked like they were slowly dying from lack of opportunity. The packaging plant sat like a concrete fortress on the edge of Riverside, surrounded by chain-link fence and parking lots, filled with vehicles that had seen better decades. Carter showed his badge at the security gate and explained he needed to speak with one of their employees. The guard made a call, and a few minutes later a manager appeared, a harried-looking man in his 50s with a clipboard and a permanently stressed expression. Carter explained the situation as delicately as he could, watching the manager's face shift from annoyance at the interruption to concern as the gravity of the situation became clear. The manager led him through the facility, past massive machinery and workers moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who had performed the same tasks thousands of times. They found Jameson Brennan on the packaging line, his hands moving in practiced motions as he sealed boxes and loaded them onto pallets. He was younger than Carter expected, probably not even 30, but he had the exhausted look of someone twice that age, thin to the point of being gaunt, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders that curved inward as if carrying an invisible weight. When the manager called his name, Jameson looked up with the startled expression of someone expecting bad news because bad news was all he ever got anymore. His eyes landed on Carter's uniform, and the color drained from his already pale face. He knew. Somehow he already knew this was about Ellie. Carter asked if they could speak privately, and they moved to a break room that smelled of burnt coffee and microwaved meals. Jameson sat down heavily in a plastic chair, his hands shaking as they rested on the table. Before Carter could say anything, Jameson started talking, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He explained that he had arranged for Ellie to stay with Margaret at the bakery, that he had told her Margaret would watch her, that she would be safe there until his shift ended. But even as he said it, his voice faltered, uncertainty creeping in. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages, trying to find proof of an arrangement that Carter suspected had never actually been made. The truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. Jameson had convinced himself of a plan that existed only in his exhausted, desperate mind. He had told Ellie to go to the bakery, had told her to wait there, had believed that somehow it would all work out because it had to, because he didn't have any other options. Carter watched this man fall apart, watched him realize the full extent of his failure, and he felt a complicated mix of anger and pity. He explained that Ellie was in the hospital, that she was malnourished and neglected, that Child Protective Services would be involved. Jameson's face crumpled, and he started to cry with the kind of raw, ugly grief that came from the depths of a soul that knew it had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He kept saying he was sorry, that he tried, that he didn't know what else to do, that the powder was supposed to help, that it was full of vitamins and protein and was supposed to be good for her, that he couldn't afford real groceries and keep the electricity on and pay for gas to get to work. The words poured out, a confession and a plea and a breakdown all at once. Carter let him talk, let him empty himself of all the guilt and fear and desperation he had been carrying. And when Jameson finally fell silent, his head in his hands, Carter asked the question that had been gnawing at him since he first saw Ellie in the bakery. He asked about Ellie's mother, about what had happened to leave Jameson alone with a child he clearly couldn't care for. Jameson looked up, his face streaked with tears and something like shame. He said her name was Vivian, and she had left 2 years ago, just walked out one day and never came back. No note, no explanation, just gone. He had tried to find her, tried to understand why, but she had disappeared completely. And he had been left with Ellie, this beautiful, innocent child who deserved so much better than what he could give her. He had tried to be enough, tried to be both parents, tried to work enough hours to provide everything she needed. But he was drowning, sinking deeper every day, and he hadn't known how to ask for help because asking for help felt like admitting he had failed, and admitting failure meant they might take Ellie away. The terrible irony hung in the air between them. By trying so hard to keep Ellie, by refusing to ask for help, Jameson had guaranteed the very outcome he feared most. Carter took a deep breath and explained what would happen next. Jameson would need to come with him, would need to speak with CPS, would need to cooperate fully if he had any hope of eventually getting Ellie back. There would be investigations, assessments, requirements he would have to meet. It would be a long process, and there were no guarantees. Jameson nodded numbly, his fight gone, replaced by a hollow acceptance. As they walked out of the factory, past the curious stares of co-workers, Carter found himself thinking about the thin line between poverty and neglect, about how easily people fell through the cracks of a society that claimed to care for its most vulnerable. Jameson Brennan wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had been left alone with more than he could handle, who had made terrible choices out of desperation and ignorance, and now a child would pay the price for the failures of everyone around her. The drive back to Millbrook was quiet, Jameson staring out the window with empty eyes, Carter's mind churning with thoughts of what came next. They arrived at the hospital as evening settled over the town, the lights inside warm and bright against the gathering darkness. Carter led Jameson inside, where Diana Thorne, the CPS caseworker, was already waiting. She was a woman in her 40s with practical short hair and eyes that had seen every kind of family crisis imaginable. She greeted them with professional courtesy tinged with sympathy, and Carter felt a small measure of relief. Diana was tough but fair, and if anyone could navigate this mess, it was her. They took Jameson to a conference room where he would be interviewed, where the formal process of determining Ellie's future would begin. But before that, Diana allowed him a few minutes to see his daughter. They went to Ellie's room, Carter standing back to give them space but staying close enough to observe. Ellie was sitting up in bed, wearing a hospital gown that was too big for her, looking small and lost against the white sheets. When she saw her father, her face lit up with pure joy, and she reached out her arms. Jameson rushed to her, gathering her into a hug that spoke of all the love he had never been able to translate into proper care. They cried together, Ellie saying she was sorry if she did something wrong, Jameson telling her over and over that she was perfect, that everything was his fault, that he loved her more than anything in the world. Carter watched this moment of connection and felt tears burning in his own eyes. This was the cruelty of the situation. There was real love here, genuine bond between parent and child. But love alone wasn't enough. Love didn't put food on the table, or keep children safe, or teach them that they mattered. Ellie needed more than her father's love. She needed stability, proper nutrition, security, and the knowledge that she didn't have to be invisible to survive. After a few minutes, Diana gently intervened, explaining to Ellie that her daddy had to go talk to some people, but that he would be back soon. Ellie nodded, her small face brave even as her fingers clutched Jameson's sleeve. She whispered something to him, so quiet that only he could hear, and Jameson's face crumpled again. He kissed her forehead, promised her that he would fix this, that he would do better, and then he let Diana lead him away. Carter stayed with Ellie, who watched her father leave with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. She looked at Carter and asked if her daddy was going to jail, if this was all her fault for not waiting quietly enough. Carter sat down in the chair beside her bed and told her with absolute certainty that none of this was her fault, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes grown-ups made mistakes and it was other grown-ups' jobs to help fix them. He wasn't sure if she believed him, but he hoped someday she would. As night fell over Millbrook, Ellie drifted off to sleep in her hospital bed, monitored by nurses and surrounded by medical equipment that beeped softly in the darkness. Carter remained for a while, watching this child who had somehow become important to him in the span of a single day. He thought about all the Ellies in the world, all the children suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice them. And he made a silent promise to himself and to her that he would do everything in his power to make sure her waiting was over, that her voice would be heard, that her life would get better even if the road there was long and painful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and complicated processes. But tonight, Ellie was safe, warm, and cared for. And for now, Carter told himself, that had to be enough. In the days following Ellie's hospitalization, Carter found himself increasingly involved in a case that had become more than just another incident report. Diana Thorne kept him updated on the proceedings, appreciating his insight and his clear investment in the outcome. The investigation into the Brennan family situation unfolded with the methodical efficiency of bureaucracy, but Carter could see the human cost in every document, every interview, every decision point. The medical team worked to stabilize Ellie's physical condition. They put her on a carefully monitored nutrition plan designed to address her deficiencies without overwhelming her system. Dr. Chen explained that refeeding had to be done gradually, that rushing it could cause serious complications. Ellie gained a little weight, the hollow look in her cheeks began to fill out slightly, but the emotional damage would take far longer to heal. Diana arranged for Ellie to be placed with a foster family while the case moved through the system. The Morrisons were experienced foster parents in their early 50s, with a warm home in a quiet neighborhood and a track record of caring for children in crisis. Carter met them before the placement, wanting to assess them himself, even though he knew it wasn't really his role. Patricia Morrison had kind eyes and a gentle manner, while her husband Robert was quieter, but projected a steady reliability. They seemed genuinely committed to helping children, and Carter felt a small measure of reassurance. On the day Ellie was discharged from the hospital to go to the Morrison home, Carter was there. She had been in the hospital for 5 days, long enough to become attached to some of the nurses, especially a young woman named Kelly who had spent extra time reading to her. When it was time to leave, Ellie's face showed a mix of relief at leaving the hospital and fear of the unknown ahead. She held tight to a stuffed rabbit that Patricia Morrison had brought for her, its soft ears clutched in her small fist like a lifeline. Carter drove them to the Morrison house, following Diana's car through streets that gradually shifted from commercial to residential, from busy to quiet. The Morrison home was a 2-story colonial with a front porch and a yard, where flowers would bloom in spring. It looked like something from a storybook, the kind of house where safe, happy childhoods happened. But Carter could see the tension in Ellie's small body as they walked up the path, the way she made herself smaller, preparing for disappointment because that's what life had taught her to expect. Inside, Patricia showed Ellie to a bedroom that had been prepared for her. It was painted a soft yellow, with cheerful curtains and a bed covered in a quilt with sunflowers. There were books on a shelf and toys in a basket and everything a child might need to feel welcomed. But Ellie just stood in the doorway, not entering, as if afraid that touching anything would make it disappear or get her in trouble. Patricia gently encouraged her to come in, to explore, to make herself at home. But Ellie remained frozen. It was Carter who finally got her to move. He knelt down beside her and asked if she wanted to show him the room, if she could give him a tour. The small responsibility, the chance to be helpful, seemed to reach through her fear. She took a tentative step inside, then another, pointing out the books and the window that looked out onto the backyard. Carter praised her, told her it was a beautiful room, and gradually, Ellie's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. When it was time for Carter to leave, Ellie's face fell. She had come to see him as a constant, the adult who showed up when everything else was falling apart. He promised her he would visit, that he would check on her, that she wasn't alone even though it might feel that way sometimes. She nodded but didn't smile, and as Carter walked back to his car, he felt the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Jameson Brennan was navigating his own difficult path. Diana had explained the requirements for reunification. He needed to secure stable housing, maintain steady employment, complete parenting classes, attend therapy, and demonstrate consistent positive change over an extended period. It was a daunting list for someone who had barely been keeping his head above water before, but the alternative was losing Ellie permanently. Carter found himself drawn into Jameson's story as well, checking in on him periodically, connecting him with resources, acting as an unofficial mentor, even though it blurred professional lines. He saw in Jameson something he recognized from his own past. The desperate struggle of people trying to survive in a system that wasn't designed to help them succeed. Jameson attended his first parenting class with visible reluctance, sitting in a community center room with other parents who all looked as overwhelmed as he felt. The instructor, a woman named Susan with years of social work experience, taught them things that seemed obvious but weren't to people who had never learned them. How to create structure and routine for children. How to recognize and respond to emotional needs. How to ask for help without shame. Jameson absorbed it all with the intensity of someone studying for the most important test of his life. Carter met with Jameson after one of these classes, buying him coffee at a diner on the edge of town. Jameson looked exhausted, but different somehow, less defeated. He talked about what he was learning, about how much he hadn't known, about the ways his own childhood had left him unprepared for parenthood. His voice cracked when he admitted that he had been repeating patterns from his own neglectful upbringing without even realizing it, that he had thought love alone was enough because it was more than he had received. The conversation revealed layers Carter hadn't expected. Jameson talked about growing up in a series of foster homes after his mother abandoned him, and his father went to prison for drug charges. He had aged out of the system at 18 with no support, no skills, no real understanding of how to build a stable life. He met Vivian when he was 23, and she had seemed like salvation, someone who understood struggle because she came from it too. They had Ellie without planning it, 2 kids trying to raise a kid, and for a while, they had managed. But Vivian had demons Jameson didn't understand, trauma from her own past that she had never addressed, and one day the weight of it all became too much. She left, and Jameson was alone with a 5-year-old daughter, and no idea how to be the parent she needed. Listening to this history, Carter understood more fully the complexity of the situation. This wasn't simple neglect born of malice or indifference. This was generational trauma playing out, cycles of poverty and abandonment, and inadequate support repeating themselves. Jameson loved Ellie fiercely, but he had never been taught how to translate that love into the practical acts of care that children needed. He had been failing not because he didn't care, but because no one had ever shown him how to succeed. At the Morrison house, Ellie was struggling in her own way. Patricia and Robert were patient and kind, providing structure and stability that Ellie had never experienced. Regular meals at regular times, bedtime routines with stories and tucked-in blankets, school attendance that was monitored and supported. But Ellie met all of this with a silence that worried everyone. She complied with everything asked of her, never protested, never asked for anything, moved through her days like a small ghost. At night, Patricia would hear her crying softly in her room, but when she went to comfort her, Ellie would immediately stop and pretend to be asleep. Diana brought in a child therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who specialized in trauma. Dr. Martinez met with Ellie weekly in sessions that felt more like play than therapy. She used art and dolls and gentle conversation to try to reach the scared child hiding behind Ellie's compliant facade. Slowly, carefully, she began to understand the depth of Ellie's emotional wound. Ellie blamed herself for everything that had happened. In her child's logic, if she had been better, quieter, less hungry, less needy, her mother wouldn't have left and her father wouldn't have struggled. She had internalized the message that her very existence was a burden, that the safest thing to do was take up as little space as possible and need as little as possible. Dr. Martinez shared these insights with Diana and with Carter when he asked, and the knowledge broke his heart all over again. Carter started visiting Ellie regularly at the Morrison house, keeping his promise. He would come by after his shift, still in uniform, and Ellie's face would light up in a way it didn't for anyone else. They would sit on the porch if the weather was decent, or at the kitchen table if it wasn't, and Carter would tell her stories about his day, carefully edited versions that made being a police officer sound like helping lost cats and directing traffic. Gradually, Ellie began to open up to him, small comments about her day at school or the book Patricia had read to her. Once she asked Carter if her daddy was okay, if he was eating enough, if someone was taking care of him the way the Morrisons were taking care of her. The question revealed the reversal that had happened in Ellie's life. where she had been the one worrying about her parents' welfare instead of the other way around. Carter assured her that her daddy was working hard to be better, that he missed her very much, and that everyone was trying to help. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Ellie had been placed with the Morrisons, Carter arrived to find her sitting in the yard with a drawing pad, creating elaborate pictures with colored pencils. He sat down beside her and asked what she was drawing. She showed him a picture of a house, and inside the house were stick figures labeled with careful printing. There was one labeled Daddy, one labeled Ellie, and after a moment's hesitation she added another figure, smaller and off to the side, labeled Mommy. Carter asked her about the picture, about what was happening in her drawing. Ellie was quiet for a long time before she said in a voice barely above a whisper that she was drawing what she wished for, a house where everyone was together and happy, and no one had to leave or be hungry. The simplicity of her wish, the fundamental human need for family and security, struck Carter with painful force. She wasn't asking for anything extraordinary, just the basic building blocks of childhood that every kid deserved. As autumn deepened into early winter, the case moved forward with bureaucratic slowness. Jameson attended every class, every therapy session, every meeting with Diana. He maintained his job at the packaging plant, cutting back to single shifts so he would have time for everything else required of him. He found a small apartment in Millbrook proper, closer to resources and support, leaving behind the isolated mobile home. Diana conducted home visits, checking off boxes on her evaluation forms, documenting progress but remaining cautiously neutral about the ultimate outcome. The first supervised visit between Jameson and Ellie was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a family visitation center, a cheerful building that tried hard not to feel institutional, but couldn't quite hide its purpose. Carter wasn't required to be there, but Diana invited him, knowing his presence would help both Jameson and Ellie. They met in a room filled with toys and books, with a large window that allowed the supervising social worker to observe while giving the illusion of privacy. When Ellie saw her father, she ran to him with a burst of emotion that shattered her usual careful control. Jameson scooped her up, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair as his shoulders shook with silent crying. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, reconnecting after weeks of separation. The visit was both beautiful and heartbreaking. They played games and read books, and Jameson showed Ellie pictures of his new apartment, telling her about the room he was preparing for her, about the park nearby where they could go when she came home. Ellie listened with wide eyes, wanting desperately to believe but afraid to hope too much. She asked him careful questions about whether he was eating enough, whether he was sleeping okay, whether he was sad without her. The role reversal was still there, this little girl trying to take care of her father, even as she needed him to take care of her. Jameson, to his credit, recognized it. He told Ellie that he was okay, that she didn't need to worry about him, that it was his job to take care of her and he was learning how to do it better. The words were right, but Carter could see the long road ahead before those words translated into a reality Ellie could trust. When the visit ended, Ellie's face crumpled as she was told it was time to go back to the Morrisons. She clung to Jameson, begging him not to make her leave, asking why she couldn't just come home with him. Jameson looked to Diana with desperate eyes, but Diana gently explained that he wasn't quite ready yet, that they needed a little more time to make sure everything was safe and stable. It was the right answer legally and practically, but it felt cruel. Carter helped Patricia coax Ellie into the car, and as they drove away, he watched Jameson standing in the parking lot, his hand raised in a wave that Ellie couldn't see through her tears, and he wondered how many more times they would have to break this little girl's heart in the name of protecting her. That night, Carter lay awake thinking about the case, about the impossible choices and the painful waiting and the uncertain outcome. He thought about how the system was designed to protect children, but sometimes felt like it was punishing everyone involved. He thought about Ellie drawing pictures of a family reunited, and Jameson working desperately to become someone he had never been taught to be. And he thought about his own role in all of this, the lines he had crossed, the investment he had made in an outcome he couldn't control. His phone rang just past midnight, jarring him from restless half-sleep. It was Patricia Morrison, her voice tight with concern. Ellie had woken up from a nightmare screaming for her father, and now she was refusing to calm down, hyperventilating and crying so hard she was making herself sick. Patricia didn't know what to do, whether to call emergency services or Diana or who could help. Carter told her he would be there in 10 minutes. He drove through empty streets, his car's headlights cutting through darkness, arriving at the Morrison house to find lights blazing in every window. Patricia met him at the door looking haggard and worried. He could hear Ellie from upstairs, her small voice calling for her daddy over and over. He went up to her room and found her curled in a ball on her bed, her face red and swollen from crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Carter approached slowly, speaking softly, and when she saw him, she reached out with desperate hands. He sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her into his arms, letting her sob against his uniform shirt, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. He didn't try to stop her crying or tell her it would be okay. He just held her, rubbing her back in slow circles, letting her release all the pain she had been holding inside. Gradually, her sobs quieted to hiccups and then to exhausted sniffles. She looked up at Carter with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so small, and asked him in a voice hoarse from crying if her daddy still wanted her, if maybe he was happier without her being a problem. The question gutted Carter. He told her with absolute conviction that her father loved her more than anything in the world, that he was working so hard to bring her home, that she wasn't a problem, but a gift, the most important thing in her daddy's life. He wasn't sure if she believed him, but she nodded and let him tuck her back into bed. He sat beside her until she fell into fitful sleep, and then he stayed longer, watching this child who had somehow claimed a piece of his heart. And he made another silent promise that he would do everything in his power to make sure her story had a better ending. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and silent, covering Millbrook in white. It felt like a fresh start, like hope, like the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. Carter wanted desperately to believe it, for Ellie's sake and for Jameson's and for his own need to think that sometimes the system worked and love got a second chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and more painful waiting. But tonight, Ellie slept, and that had to be enough. The weeks that followed were marked by slow progress and persistent setbacks, the kind of grinding forward motion that tested everyone's endurance. Winter settled over Millbrook with cold determination, bare trees standing stark against gray skies, snow accumulating in layers that made everything look clean, even when it wasn't. Carter continued his dual role as police officer and unofficial advocate, checking in on both Ellie and Jameson, carrying information between them when official channels felt too cold and impersonal. Jameson completed his parenting classes with dedication that impressed even the instructors. He took detailed notes, asked questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand, and applied what he learned with careful intentionality. In therapy, he began unpacking his own childhood trauma, examining the patterns that had shaped him, learning to recognize triggers and develop healthier responses. It was painful work, pulling apart the foundations of his identity to rebuild something stronger, but he persisted because the alternative was unthinkable. Diana conducted her fourth home visit to Jameson's new apartment on a Tuesday morning, when weak winter sunlight filtered through the windows. The place was small but clean, 2 bedrooms with furniture that was old but well-maintained. Jameson had prepared Ellie's room with obvious care. The walls were painted a soft purple, and there was a bed with a comforter covered in stars, a bookshelf with age-appropriate books, a small desk for homework. Diana took notes on her tablet, her expression professionally neutral, but Carter, who had accompanied her, could see the slight softening around her eyes. This was a home, not just a space. This was a father who was trying. But trying and succeeding were different things, and Diana needed to be sure before she could recommend reunification. She asked Jameson about his support system, about what would happen if he faced a crisis, about his plan for managing work and childcare responsibilities. Jameson's answers were thoughtful, showing he had considered these questions himself. He had connected with a community support group for single parents, had arranged flexible hours at work, had identified backup childcare through a local community center. He pulled out a calendar where he had mapped out routines and schedules, color-coded and detailed. Diana asked more questions, probing for weaknesses, but Jameson met each one with evidence of preparation. The conversation shifted to Vivian, the absent mother whose leaving had catalyzed this crisis. Diana asked if Jameson had heard from her, if there was any risk she might return and destabilize the situation. Jameson's face clouded with complicated emotions. He admitted that he had been searching for her, not to reunite but to understand, to find closure, to maybe give Ellie some answers about why her mother had left. Through persistent effort, and some help from online search tools, he had finally located her in a women's shelter in Vermont, 3 hours away. He had called, nervous and uncertain, expecting anger or rejection. Instead, he had found a woman who was broken in different ways than when she left, who had been running from demons she couldn't name, and had finally found help. Vivian was in treatment, Jameson explained, for complex PTSD stemming from childhood abuse he had never known about. She had left not because she didn't love Ellie, but because she was terrified she would hurt her, that the darkness inside would somehow infect their daughter. It was twisted logic born of mental illness, but it came from a place of desperate protection rather than abandonment. Vivian wanted to eventually reconnect with Ellie, to be part of her life in whatever capacity was appropriate, but she understood she had no right to demand anything. Diana absorbed this information, her mind already working through the implications. A mother returning could complicate everything or could provide additional support, depending on the circumstances. She made notes to follow up, to assess Vivian's stability, to consider how to potentially facilitate supervised contact. Carter felt a mix of emotions hearing about Vivian. Part of him was angry at her for leaving, for causing this whole painful situation. But part of him understood that mental illness wasn't a choice, that sometimes people were doing the best they could, even when their best looked like abandonment. At the Morrison house, Ellie continued her own difficult journey. The therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez were slowly helping her understand that she wasn't responsible for the adults in her life, that it was okay to be a child with needs and wants. She was talking more, asking for things occasionally, showing small flashes of normal kid behavior like complaining about homework or asking for a particular snack. Patricia and Robert treated these moments like victories, which they were. School was a mixed experience. Ellie was behind academically, having missed so much over the past year, and she struggled to focus in class. But her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was patient and understanding, providing extra support and celebrating small improvements. Ellie was beginning to make friends cautiously, drawn to other quiet kids who didn't demand too much too fast. She still had moments of retreat, days when she barely spoke and moved through the world like she was trying to disappear, but they were becoming less frequent. The supervised visits between Ellie and Jameson increased in frequency and duration as Jameson demonstrated consistent progress. They went from 1 hour a week to 2 hours twice a week, and then to half-day visits on Saturdays. During these visits, Jameson worked hard to be the father he had learned he should be. He brought healthy snacks, engaged in age-appropriate activities, listened more than he talked, provided structure and boundaries with gentleness. Carter observed one of these visits and was struck by the transformation in both of them. Jameson was more confident, more present, less overwhelmed by the simple act of parenting, and Ellie was gradually relaxing into the relationship, laughing more naturally, initiating conversation, allowing herself to be a kid around her father. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when Jameson's patience was tested, or Ellie withdrew into protective silence. But they were building something new together, a relationship based not on desperate survival, but on genuine care and learned skills. One Saturday visit in late January, 3 months after Ellie had been placed in foster care, Jameson took her to a small park near his apartment. The snow was thick on the ground, and they built a snowman together, Ellie's laughter ringing out clear and pure in the cold air. Jameson showed her how to make snow angels, and they lay side by side in the snow, waving their arms and legs, their breath visible in the freezing air. For a moment watching them, Carter saw what they could be, what they were fighting to become. A real family, imperfect but loving, struggling but surviving. After the park, Jameson brought Ellie back to his apartment for the first time. A milestone that Diana had finally approved. Ellie walked through the space with wide eyes, taking in the simple furniture, the clean kitchen, the room that had been prepared for her. She stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, just looking, before turning to her father, with tears streaming down her face. She asked if this was really for her, if she could really come. She walked through the space with wide eyes, taking in the simple furniture, the clean kitchen, the room that had been prepared for her. She stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, just looking, before turning to her father with tears streaming down her face. She asked if this was really for her, if she could really come back home someday. Jameson knelt beside her and told her softly that he was trying every day to be the father she deserved, that this room would always be waiting for her. Ellie stepped inside, touching the quilt, the books, the window, her small hands trembling but hopeful. That afternoon, they read together until Diana arrived to pick Ellie up, a bittersweet goodbye hanging in the air. Jameson promised to keep working, and Ellie promised to keep hoping. As winter faded into a cold spring, Diana scheduled more frequent visits, each longer than the last. Ellie grew more comfortable, helping Jameson cook simple meals, picking out her favorite stories to read, and laughing at the silly jokes he tried to tell. The sense of family tentatively started to return, stitched together by hard-earned trust and determination. In April, Diana convened a meeting to assess Jameson's fit for reunification. Carter testified to his growth, to the routines in the tidy apartment, to the honest effort he put into every task. Vivian, having stabilized in treatment, requested to be part of Ellie's life in a supervised capacity. The meeting was tense, everyone aware of the weight of what was at stake. The recommendation was to begin transition planning, allowing Ellie weekends at home before a final decision. Ellie's first weekend home felt magical and scary all at once. They baked bread together, letting the rich scent fill the apartment. Jameson let Ellie pick the music, and together they cleaned, played, and laughed. At night, she asked for a bedtime story, curling up close while Jameson read softly, his voice shaky but filled with love. Both felt the enormity of what had been lost and found. Sunday morning, Carter stopped by with breakfast from the bakery, Margaret having sent extra treats in a box marked with Ellie's name. They ate together, the scene quiet, filled with gentle questions and hopeful answers. Carter watched the growing connection and tried to imagine what their future might hold. When Ellie returned to the Morrisons for the week, she cried, not from fear but from the sudden absence of joy she'd rediscovered. Patricia comforted her, promising that she'd be home again soon, that their home would always be a safe place whenever she needed it. School became easier for Ellie. With Carter's encouragement and Jameson's support, she started sharing in class, raising her hand, joining group projects. She made a close friend named Rose, bonding over shared interests in drawing and music. Mrs. Henderson sent positive reports home, excited about Ellie's progress both academically and socially. Jameson continued to show up for his appointments, documenting every meal, each bedtime, each story read. Diana, seeing the growth, submitted her final recommendation. Ellie should return home, with ongoing support and regular check-ins. The court hearing loomed, slow and heavy. Carter sat beside Jameson, both nervous, both hopeful. The judge listened to testimonies, to Diana's thorough report, to Margaret's heartfelt letter about Ellie's strength and Jameson's efforts. Vivian spoke by video call, expressing regret and a wish to help in the future. The decision was not quick. The judge took a day to review everything, weighing hope against worry. On a bright spring morning, Jameson and Ellie waited anxiously in the courthouse corridor. The judge entered, her voice steady but warm. She explained her reasons for caution, her concerns about setbacks, and then, at last, she announced Ellie could come home, with monthly assessments and continuous support. Tears and laughter burst from both Jameson and Ellie, Carter quiet beside them, Patricia smiling proudly. That afternoon, they went together to Maple's Bakery. Margaret greeted Ellie with open arms and a warm cinnamon roll. The bakery was lighter, filled with friends and neighbors who had quietly cheered for their story. Ellie thanked everyone, her small voice steady, her eyes full of happiness. Carter watched from the door, content, renewed in his belief that even when things break, they can be healed. Jameson and Ellie returned to their apartment, the purple room now truly hers. Vivian visited on supervised weekends, slowly rebuilding trust, showing Ellie that family could stretch and change, but love remained. Through summer and fall, Ellie flourished. She ate healthy meals, grew taller, learned new things, made more friends. She laughed easily, cried less, cared for her father, and let herself be cared for. Carter stopped by often, always welcomed. Margaret sent bread on special days, Mrs. Callahan from the trailer park mailed cards, and Patricia remained a cherished family friend. The entire community had joined in Ellie's healing, woven together by kindness, patience, and the conviction that no child should ever have to wait alone. On a brisk autumn day, Ellie tucked her hand into her father's as they watched leaves fall in the park. She asked if the waiting was over now, and Jameson assured her that together, they would never let silence win again. Carter arrived with hot cocoa, laughing about the early chill, and Ellie invited him to stay. As evening fell, the kitchen filled with music and stories, a tapestry of warmth and hope that wrapped around their hearts. Ellie's promise, the one she made to herself in the bakery, was finally kept. She belonged, she was seen, and above all, she was home. The bakery's doors swung open to new mornings, each filled with laughter, the smell of bread and the certainty that every voice, even the quiet ones, deserved to be heard.